If this is fake, then why does it feel like I'm the only one who doesn't get to leave? The question looped in my head as his hand settled at the small of my back, warm, steady, and entirely unnecessary for a room full of people already convinced we were in love. The ballroom lights reflecting off polished marble and crystal, while laughter and clinking glasses blurred into background noise. Because all I could focus on was the way Alexander Hayes stood too close. Like proximity was part of the contract. Like breathing the same air was a requirement I somehow missed in the fine print. 3 weeks ago, I was eating dollar pizza on the edge of my bed in a 450 square foot walk-up, scrolling job listings that never called back, and now I was wearing a custom suit that fit like it knew me better than I knew myself, standing beside a man who owned buildings I used to get lost staring up at, pretending to be his fiancé for cameras, investors, and a very public scandal that needed a clean, convincing fix. It was supposed to be simple, transactional, temporary. His words, not mine. No feelings, no complications, no overlap between the role and whatever passed for real life. And I agreed because the money was more than I'd ever seen in one place, and because I told myself I could handle it. That pretending was easy. That walking away would be easier. It was, at first, all scripted smiles and practiced touches, his fingers brushing mine just long enough for photos. His voice low and controlled when he said my name like it belonged in his mouth. And I played along, hit every mark, followed every cue, until the cameras stopped flashing and nothing changed. Not the way he stood close, not the way his gaze lingered, not the way his hand stayed where it didn't need to be. You can let go, I whispered once in the quiet of an elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting us back like strangers in someone else's story. And he didn't even look at me when he replied. Why would I? Like the question itself didn't make sense, like letting go had never been part of his plan. That was the first crack, the moment something shifted from performance to something else, something harder to define, harder to ignore, and after that, things started closing in without me noticing right away. An interview that got canceled, a freelance contract that fell through, my landlord suddenly deciding to renovate and not renew my lease. Every small exit quietly disappearing until staying felt less like a choice and more like the only option left. I told myself it was coincidence, bad timing, the universe being inconvenient. But standing here tonight, with his hand steady at my back and his voice in my ear saying, stay close, like it wasn't a suggestion, I couldn't pretend anymore that I wasn't being held in place. This ends soon, I said under my breath, more to myself than to him. And for a split second, his grip tightened, subtle but unmistakable, before he leaned in just enough for only me to hear, his tone calm, almost bored. We'll see. And the worst part wasn't the way it sounded like a promise. It was the way my feet didn't move even when I told myself to walk away. I should have left the second the elevator doors opened, but instead I followed him like that was the most natural thing in the world, like my feet had already learned the path before my brain caught up, and the silence between us stretched tight as wire, humming with everything we were not saying. His penthouse was exactly what you would expect from a man like Alexander Hayes. All glass and steel and city lights pouring in through floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of place that did not feel lived in so much as controlled. Every surface too clean, too intentional, like nothing was allowed to exist there without permission, and somehow that made the way he moved through it even more unsettling, calm, precise, like he owned not just the space but the air inside it. You can go, he said as he set his cufflinks on the counter, his voice even, almost absent, and for a second I just stood there, waiting for something else, some indication that he actually meant it, but nothing came. No glance back, no shift in posture, just that quiet dismissal that should have made it easy to turn around and walk out the door. I did not move. It took me a second to realize that I was still holding my phone in my hand. Screen dark, no missed calls, no messages, no reason to stay. And yet I was rooted in place like the idea of leaving required more effort than I had left. Ethan, he said again, this time with a slight edge, not sharp, but enough to pull me back. And when I finally looked at him, really looked, there was something different there, something I could not quite name, not anger, not impatience, something quieter and more dangerous because it did not announce itself. The contract is still active, I said, because that was safer than saying I did not want to go. safer than admitting I was not sure where I would go if I did. And his gaze held mine for a fraction too long before he nodded once, like that was the answer he had expected all along. Then act like it, he replied, and the words should have sounded like a reminder, professional, detached, but they did not. They settled somewhere deeper, heavier, like a line being drawn that I had not noticed crossing. I exhaled slowly, setting my phone down on the nearest surface because holding on to it suddenly felt pointless, like an exit that was no longer real. And when I stepped closer, it was not because he asked me to, not because the cameras were still watching, but because something in the room had shifted and I was already inside it. His hand found my wrist again, familiar now, like it belonged there. And this time when he spoke, his voice was lower, not for anyone else to hear, just for me. You hesitate every time you say, you want to leave. And I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it. But the words did not come, because he was not wrong. And that was the part that unsettled me the most. That does not mean anything. I managed finally, even as my pulse betrayed me, steady but faster than it should have been, and his thumb brushed lightly against my wrist, a small movement, barely there, but enough to send a ripple through the silence between us. It means you are still here, he said simply, like that was the only truth that mattered, like everything else was just noise, and I hated how easily that settled into place, how quickly it made sense, because standing there in a place that was never supposed to be mine, with a man who was never supposed to matter, I realized I could not remember the exact moment this stopped being temporary and started feeling like something I might not be able to walk away from. Sleep did not come easily in a place like his, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was too perfect. The kind of silence that pressed against your ears until your own thoughts sounded too loud. And I lay there staring at a ceiling I could not even see clearly in the dark, replaying every word he had said like there was something hidden between them I had missed. I told myself it was just a temporary arrangement, just a contract, just a role I had agreed to play, but the truth kept slipping through the cracks, quiet and persistent, asking why I had not walked out when I had the chance. Asking why I was still here when nothing was physically stopping me from leaving. Morning came too quickly, pale lights spilling across the floor as the city woke up below, distant traffic humming like a reminder that the world outside still existed, even if it felt far away from this place. I found him already awake, standing by the window with a cup of coffee, posture straight, expression unreadable, like he had never left that exact spot, like time moved differently around him. You are still here, he said without turning, not surprised, not questioning, just stating it like a fact that had already been decided, and something in my chest tightened at how certain he sounded. I told you the contract is active, I replied, forcing a steadiness into my voice that I did not fully feel. And when he finally turned to look at me, there was that same quiet intensity again, not overwhelming, not obvious, but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Then you should be ready, he said, setting the cup down with deliberate precision, every movement controlled, every detail accounted for, and I realized with a small, uncomfortable jolt that this was how he handled everything, not just business, not just scandals, but people too. The day moved quickly after that, schedules laid out, appearances planned. Every hour accounted for like there was no room for deviation, and I followed along because it was easier than questioning it. Easier than admitting that I did not know where I would go if I stepped outside of it. Cameras flashed again. Reporters smiled too brightly. Questions thrown at us like confetti. And I played my part, leaning in at the right moments, letting his hand guide me just enough to sell the image they wanted. But it was the moments in between that unsettled me. The ones no one else noticed, where his fingers lingered a second, longer than necessary, where his gaze stayed on me even after the cameras turned away. You are overthinking, he murmured at one point when I hesitated, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. And I almost laughed at that because of course I was overthinking. How could I not when nothing about this felt simple anymore? This is not just about the contract, I said before I could stop myself, the words slipping out softer than I intended, and for a brief second, something shifted in his expression, subtle but real, like a crack in something carefully maintained. He stepped closer, closing the small distance between us that I had not even realized I had created, and his voice dropped just enough to make the space feel smaller, more contained. It never was, he said, and the calm certainty in his tone sent a quiet shock through me. Because that was not part of the deal. That was not something we had agreed on. And yet the way he said it made it sound like it had always been. Understood. I swallowed, trying to find something solid to hold on to, some version of logic that still made sense. But all I could think was that if this was no longer just a contract, then I had no idea what it had become, and more importantly, I had no idea how to leave it. The car ride back was quiet in a way that did not feel empty but full, like something unspoken was sitting between us, heavy and patient, waiting for one of us to acknowledge it, but neither of us did, and I watched the city blur past the window, neon reflections stretching across the glass like something unreal, something I was not entirely part of anymore. I kept thinking about what he said, about how easily he dismissed the idea that this was ever just a contract, and the more I turned it over in my mind, the less it made sense, because if it was never just business for him, then what exactly had I agreed to? You are distracted. His voice cut through my thoughts, calm but precise, and I turned slightly, meeting his gaze for a brief second before looking away again, because holding it for too long felt like stepping into something deeper than I was ready for. I am thinking, I replied, and he gave a small nod, like that was expected, like my confusion was simply another detail he had already accounted for. Back at the penthouse, everything looked the same as it had the night before, untouched, controlled, but I felt different standing inside it now, more aware of the edges, of the invisible lines I had crossed without realizing. I moved toward the kitchen, more out of habit than intention, pouring myself a glass of water just to have something to do with my hands, something to ground me. But even that felt unfamiliar, like I was borrowing a life that did not belong to me. Ethan, he said again, and there was something about the way he said my name that made me pause, not sharp, not demanding, but certain, like he knew I would stop, like he knew I would listen. What happens when this is over? I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out quieter than I intended but impossible to take back, and for the first time since I had met him, there was a slight delay before he answered. Not long, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. It depends, he said finally, and I turned to face him fully now, because that was not an answer, that was a deflection, and I was starting to recognize the difference. On what? I pressed, and he stepped closer, closing the distance again like it was the most natural thing in the world, like space was something he adjusted at will, not something we both had a say in. On whether you decide to leave, he replied, his voice low, steady, and that same quiet certainty was there again, the kind that did not need to be raised to be felt. I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, because that sounded simple, too simple, like the choice was still mine, like I had not already been slowly guided into a position where leaving felt less like freedom and more like loss. You keep saying that like it is entirely up to me, I said, and something in his expression shifted again, subtle but real, like I had finally said something that mattered. It is, he answered, but there was a weight behind it now, something heavier than before, something that made the words feel incomplete. I shook my head slightly, because that was not true, not completely, not anymore, and he knew it. Then why does it feel like every time I think about walking away, something changes? I asked, my voice quieter now, more honest than I intended, and for a moment, he just looked at me. Really looked, like he was deciding how much to say, how much to reveal. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost gentle, but the words settled deep. Because you are starting to realize what you would be leaving behind. And that was the problem, because I did not know if he meant the contract, the life, or him, and the fact that I could not tell the difference anymore was exactly what scared me the most. I did not sleep that night either, not really, because his words stayed with me in a way that felt too deliberate to ignore, like he had placed them there knowing they would settle in and refuse to leave. And I lay awake staring at the faint outline of the city beyond the glass, trying to convince myself that I still had control over this situation, that I could still walk away if I chose to. But every time I followed that thought to its conclusion, it ended in the same quiet question I could not answer. Where would I go? Morning came again, soft light filtering through the windows, and for a brief moment everything felt almost normal, like I could pretend this was just another day. But that illusion faded the second I stepped out and saw him already waiting, dressed, composed, like he had been up for hours, like he had never once questioned any part of this. "We have a meeting," he said, his tone neutral. But there was that same underlying certainty again, the kind that assumed I would follow without needing to be told twice. And I did, because arguing felt pointless when I could not even define what I was arguing against anymore. The building we entered was all polished stone and quiet authority, the kind of place where every step echoed just enough to remind you that you did not belong unless you had a reason to be there. And apparently, now I did. Introductions blurred together. Names I would forget as soon as they were spoken, firm handshakes, polite smiles, and through it all, his hand rested lightly at my back, guiding but not forcing, a presence that felt both reassuring and restrictive at the same time. "Stay close," he murmured once as we moved through the crowd, and I almost laughed at how unnecessary that sounded, because where else would I go in a place like this, in a life like this? The meeting itself passed in a controlled rhythm. Conversations layered with meaning I could only partially follow, but I paid attention to him, too. The way he spoke, the way he listened, the way everything seemed to align around him without effort, and it was unsettling to realize how easily I fit into that pattern, how naturally I adapted to the role beside him. Afterward, as we stepped back into the quieter hallway, I finally said it, because the question had been building all morning, pressing against my thoughts until I could not ignore it anymore. "You planned this, did not you?" And he paused just slightly, enough to acknowledge the weight behind the words. "Planned what?" he asked, but there was no real confusion in his tone, just a careful neutrality that told me he understood exactly what I meant. "All of it." I continued, my voice steady even as something inside me tightened. "The contract, the timing, the way everything outside of this seems to disappear the moment I think about leaving." And for a second, the silence between us felt sharper, more defined, like a line I had just stepped over. He looked at me then, really looked. And there was no deflection this time, no easy dismissal, just that same controlled calm that somehow felt more honest than any denial would have been. "I made sure nothing would interfere," he said finally, and the simplicity of it hit harder than I expected, because he was not denying it, he was confirming it, in the most precise way possible. I let out a slow breath, trying to process that, trying to decide how I felt about it. But the truth was not simple, not anger, not relief, something more complicated that I did not yet have the words for. "That is not the same as giving me a choice," I said quietly, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression in a way I could not immediately read. Something almost like hesitation, almost like he was considering something he had not planned for. "You still have one," he replied, but there was less certainty in it now, less control, and that difference, however small, was enough to make me realize that whatever this had become, it was no longer entirely one-sided, and that thought should have been reassuring, but instead, it made everything feel even more complicated, because if I did still have a choice, then the real question was not whether I could leave, but whether I actually wanted to. The word choice stayed with me longer than it should have, not whether I could leave, but whether I wanted to, and that shift was subtle but unsettling because it moved the focus away from him and placed it squarely on me, on my own hesitation, on the fact that every time I thought about walking away, I did not actually take a step. The drive back felt shorter this time, or maybe I just noticed less. My attention pulled inward instead of outward, replaying everything he had said, everything he had not said, until the silence between us felt less like distance and more like something shared. When we stepped into the penthouse again, I did not go straight to the window or the kitchen like before. I stayed near the entrance for a second longer, like I was testing something, like I was waiting to see if he would tell me to move, to follow, to stay, but he did not. He simply watched, patient, composed, like he already knew what I would do. I exhaled slowly and walked further in, and that felt like an answer I had not meant to give. "You are thinking too much," he said again, quieter this time, not as an observation but almost as a reassurance, and I turned toward him, something in me finally pushing back against the calm certainty he carried so easily. "You are not thinking enough," I replied, and the words landed sharper than I intended, but I did not take them back. His gaze shifted slightly, not surprised, but more focused, like he was adjusting to a change in the pattern. "Explain," he said, and there was no challenge in it, Just a direct request that left no room to avoid the conversation. I took a breath, steadying myself, because this was the first time I was not just reacting, not just following, but actually stepping into the space between us with intention. You say I have a choice. I began, my voice quieter but firm. But everything around me keeps narrowing until staying feels like the only option. And as I spoke, I realized how true that was, how gradually it had happened, how easily I had accepted it without questioning the shape it was taking. He listened without interrupting, his posture still, his attention fixed in a way that made it impossible to pretend this did not matter. And now, I continued, you are telling me that it depends on whether I want to leave, like that is a simple decision, like it has not already been influenced. And there it was, the part one had been circling around, the part that felt the most dangerous to say out loud. For a moment, the room felt quieter, like even the city outside had paused, and when he finally stepped closer, it was slower this time, more deliberate, like he was aware of the shift that had taken place. Everything influences every decision, he said, his tone even, but there was something different beneath it now, something less controlled, less distant. That does not mean the choice is not yours, and I held his gaze, searching for something in it, something that would tell me where the line actually was, if there even was one anymore. Then tell me honestly, I said, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice, no attempt to soften the question. If I walk out that door right now, you will not stop me. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. He did not answer immediately, and that pause, that single, measured pause, said more than any immediate response could have. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, but unmistakably certain. I would not stop you, he said, and for a second, something in me loosened, something that had been held tight since the beginning, until he added, almost as an afterthought, but I do not think you would go. And that was the part that settled deep, because he was not holding me there, not physically, not directly, but somehow, he was still right, and I hated how true it felt. For a moment I actually considered it. The door was right there behind me, a clean line between staying and leaving, between whatever this had become and whatever my life used to be, and all I had to do was turn, take a few steps, and it would be over, simple, final, exactly what I had been telling myself I wanted since the beginning, and yet I did not move. I hated that he noticed. Of course he noticed, he always did. The smallest hesitation, the shift in breathing, the way my hand flexed slightly at my side like I was preparing to reach for something I was not sure I wanted to touch. You are thinking about it, he said, not as a question but as a quiet observation, and I let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, because there was no point denying it anymore. I admitted, my voice steady even if the feeling underneath it was not, and I turned just enough to glance at the door again, just enough to remind myself that it was still there, still an option, still real. Then go, he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because there was no challenge in his tone, no pressure, just that same calm certainty that had been there from the beginning, like he was offering me something he already knew I would not take. I frowned slightly, turning back to face him fully now, searching his expression for something that would tell me this was another test, another calculated move. But all I found was that steady gaze, unreadable, and yet somehow more honest than anything else he had shown me. You really think I will not? I said, and this time there was something sharper in my voice, something closer to frustration than anything else, because the way he said it, the way he always said things, made it feel like the outcome had already been decided. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to shift the space between us again, to make the distance feel intentional rather than accidental. I think, he said slowly, each word deliberate, that if you wanted to leave, you would have already done it. And there it was again, that quiet certainty that pressed against every argument I tried to build, because it was not entirely wrong. I swallowed, the air in the room feeling heavier now, like the choice I had been clinging to was not as simple as I wanted it to be. You made sure it would not be easy, I said, and this time there was no attempt to hide the accusation in my voice, no attempt to soften it. And for a second, something shifted in his expression, not defensiveness, not denial, just a brief flicker of acknowledgement. I made sure nothing would pull you away before you understood, he replied, and that answer settled differently than I expected, not as an excuse, not as justification, but as something closer to intent, something that had been planned but not entirely controlled. I shook my head slightly, because that did not make it better, it made it more complicated, and I was starting to realize that complexity was exactly what he was comfortable with. And what exactly am I supposed to understand? I asked, my voice quieter now, more focused, because if this was no longer just about the contract, then I needed to know what it actually was. He did not answer right away, and that pause stretched just long enough to make the silence feel intentional, like he was choosing his words carefully. Like this was one of the few moments he was not completely certain how to proceed. When he finally spoke, his tone was softer, but no, less steady. That this was never temporary for me, he said, and something in my chest tightened at the simplicity of it, at the way he said it without hesitation, without room for interpretation. I stared at him, the weight of those words settling in slowly, because that changed everything, not just the contract, not just the situation, but the entire foundation of what I thought this was supposed to be. And for the first time since this started, I realized that leaving was not just about walking out a door. It was about deciding whether I was willing to let go of something that might not have been fake at all. The words should have made it easier to leave. If anything, they should have clarified everything, drawn a clean line between what was real and what was not. But instead they blurred it further, because if this was never temporary for him, then what exactly had I stepped into without realizing? And more importantly, how long had he been standing there waiting for me to catch up? I felt it in the quiet that followed. The shift in the room that made everything feel more deliberate, more defined. Like something had finally been said that could not be taken back, and I realized I was no longer standing near the door. Not really. Because even though it was still behind me, it no longer felt like an exit. It felt like a choice I was already moving away from. You should have told me, I said finally, my voice lower now, not as sharp as before but steadier, more grounded in something I could not quite name yet. And he did not look surprised, did not look defensive, just met my gaze like he had expected that response, like this was another step in something he had already mapped out. You would not have agreed, he replied simply, and I let out a breath at that, because he was probably right, because if he had told me from the beginning that this was not just a contract, that this was not just a temporary arrangement, I would have walked away before it even started, before any of this had the chance to take shape. So you decided for me, I said, and there was still an edge to it. But it was softer now, less about accusation and more about understanding how I had ended up here. I gave you a reason to stay long enough to see it, he answered, and there was something in the way he said it that made it harder to argue. Not because it justified everything, but because it made it more complicated than right or wrong. I shook my head slightly, trying to sort through that, trying to find something solid to push against, but everything felt layered now, like there was no single point I could isolate and reject without unraveling the rest of it. And what if I still choose to leave? I asked, not because I was certain I would, but because I needed to hear it again, needed to understand where that line actually was. He stepped closer, slower this time, like he was aware of the space between us in a way he had not been before. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, but no less certain. Then you leave, he said, and for a second, that answer settled cleanly, simple and direct, until he added, almost as if it was the part that mattered more. But you will know what you are leaving. And that was the difference. That was what changed everything. Because before, leaving would have meant walking away from a contract, from an arrangement, from something defined and contained. But now it meant something else entirely, something I had not fully acknowledged until this moment. I looked at him, really looked, trying to see past the control, the certainty, the way he seemed to always be one step ahead. And for the first time, I noticed something I had missed before, something quieter beneath all of that, something that did not feel calculated, something that felt almost like patience, like he had been waiting for me to reach this point on my own. You are very sure of yourself, I said, and it was not quite a challenge anymore, not quite a complaint, more like an observation I was still trying to understand, and his expression shifted just slightly, not enough to change the overall calm, but enough to suggest there was more beneath it. No, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer caught me off guard again, because it did not match the way he carried himself, did not match the certainty he projected in everything else, and for a brief moment, there was something almost honest in the space between us, something unguarded. "I am sure of you," he added, and that settled deeper than anything else he had said so far, because it was not about control, not about planning, not about making sure things went a certain way. It was about belief, about a confidence that did not rely on forcing an outcome, but on trusting that it would happen anyway, and standing there, in a place that no longer felt entirely foreign, with a man who was no longer entirely unreadable. I realized that the reason I had not walked out that door was not because I could not, and not even because he had made it difficult. It was because some part of me had already started to see what he had seen from the beginning, and I was not sure I was ready to let that go. It would have been easier if he had stayed distant, if he had kept everything controlled and calculated the way he had in the beginning, because then I could have drawn a clear line between what was real and what was not. But the moment he said he was sure of me, something shifted in a way I could not ignore, something that made everything feel less like a performance and more like a decision I had already started making without realizing it. I turned away first, not because I wanted to leave, but because I needed space to think, to breathe, to put some distance between his certainty and my own confusion, and I moved toward the window out of habit, staring down at the city that used to feel so large and unreachable and now felt strangely distant, like I was looking at a version of my life that no longer fit the same way. "You are quiet," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, not pressing, not demanding, just present, and I let out a slow breath, watching it fog faintly against the glass before disappearing. "I am trying to figure out when this changed," I admitted, and that was the truth, because somewhere between the contract and now, something had shifted without a clear moment I could point to, without a line I could trace back. I felt him move closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough that I was aware of him without needing to turn, and that awareness felt different now. Less like pressure and more like something I had grown used to, something I did not immediately want to step away from. "It did not change," he said, and there was that same quiet steadiness again, the kind that did not argue but simply existed. "You just started to see it," and I frowned slightly at that, because it sounded too simple, too clean for something that felt this complicated. "That is not fair," I said, turning to face him again, because if this had always been his intention, if this had always been more than just an arrangement, then I had been the only one walking in without understanding the full picture. "It is not supposed to be fair," he replied, and there was no apology in it, no attempt to soften the truth, just a calm acceptance of something he did not see a reason to justify. I held his gaze, searching for something to push against, something to ground myself in, but all I found was that same consistency, that same certainty that had been there from the beginning, and it was unsettling how much that steadiness affected me, how much it made everything else feel less certain by comparison. "Then what is it supposed to be?" I asked, and this time there was no edge in my voice, no frustration, just a quiet need to understand what I was actually standing in the middle of. He did not answer immediately, and that pause stretched just enough to make me aware of how much I was waiting for it, how much I needed something concrete to hold on to. When he finally spoke, his tone was lower, more measured, like he was choosing each word carefully. "It is supposed to be something you choose," he said, and I let out a small breath at that, because we had circled back to the same point again, the same idea of choice that felt both real and not entirely my own. "You keep saying that," I replied, quieter now, "but it does not feel like a choice when I am already here." And that was the part one could not ignore, the part that made everything feel more complicated than a simple decision. He stepped closer then, closing the space between us in a way that felt deliberate, not rushed, not forced, just intentional. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer than I had heard it before. "Then leave," he said. And for a second, the words settled between us like a test, like an opening he was offering without trying to guide me through it. I did not move. I could feel the moment stretching, the silence building around my hesitation, and I knew he noticed. Of course he noticed, he always did, and that made it harder somehow, knowing that my stillness was not invisible, that it meant something whether I wanted it to or not. I said finally, more to myself than to him, because I needed to hear it out loud, needed to confirm that it was still true, that I was not actually trapped here in any way that mattered. "Yes," He replied simply, and there was no doubt in his voice, no challenge, just acknowledgement. And that made it harder, not easier, because it meant the only thing holding me here was not him, not the contract, not the circumstances, it was me. I looked at him again, really looked this time, and for the first time, I realized that his certainty was not about control, it was about patience, about waiting for me to reach a conclusion he had already accepted, and that realization settled in slowly, changing the way everything felt, because if he was not forcing me to stay, then the real question was not why he would not let me go. It was why I was not leaving, and I was starting to realize that the answer had less to do with him than I wanted to admit. The realization did not come all at once. It settled in slowly, piece by piece, like something I had been avoiding finally catching up to me. And standing there with the city stretching endlessly behind me, and him standing just close enough to remind me he was still there, I understood something I had not wanted to admit before, that leaving was no longer just about walking away from him. It was about stepping back into a version of my life that no longer felt the same. I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair as I tried to ground myself in something familiar, something that still made sense, but everything felt shifted, like the frame I used to see things through had changed without me noticing. This is not what I agreed to, I said finally, because that was the closest thing I had to a solid point, something I could still hold on to. And he did not interrupt, did not dismiss it, just listened with that same steady attention that made it impossible to pretend this conversation did not matter. No, he replied after a moment, his voice calm, almost too calm. It is not. And that answer should have made it easier, should have given me a reason to push back, to draw a line. But instead it only made the space between us feel more honest, more real than anything we had said before. I let out a small, almost disbelieving breath, because he was not arguing, not trying to reframe it, just acknowledging it as it was, and that made everything harder to dismiss. Then why does it feel like I am the only one who is still pretending? I asked, and the question came out quieter than I expected, more vulnerable than I intended, because that was the truth I had been circling around without naming. For a second, something shifted in his expression, not enough to break the composure he always carried, but enough to show that the words had landed exactly where they were meant to. He stepped closer again, not in a way that cornered me, but in a way that closed the distance just enough to make the moment feel more immediate, more present. "You are not pretending," he said, and there was a certainty in his voice that made it difficult to argue, because it did not sound like persuasion. It sounded like observation. I frowned slightly, because that did not make sense, not entirely. And yet something in me recognized the truth in it before I could fully process it. "Then what am I doing?" I asked, and this time I did not look away, did not try to create distance, because avoiding it no longer felt like an option. He held my gaze, steady and unwavering, and for a moment the silence stretched between us again, not uncomfortable, not empty, just full of everything that had not been said yet. "You are deciding," he replied finally, and the simplicity of it hit harder than anything else, because it stripped everything down to its core, removed the contract, the circumstances, the explanations, and left only one thing behind. I let that settle for a second, letting the weight of it sink in, because if that was true, then everything I had been holding onto as an excuse, as a reason, as a justification, no longer applied the same way. "And if I decide wrong," I said quietly, not entirely sure what I meant by that, not entirely sure what the right choice even was anymore. His expression softened just slightly, not enough to lose the control he always carried, but enough to show that he understood the question behind the words. "Then you." "Well, no," he said, and there was something almost reassuring in that, something that suggested the outcome was not something to fear, but something to understand. I looked at him for a long moment, really looked, trying to see past everything I thought I knew about him, about this situation, about myself, and for the first time, I realized that the fear I had been holding on to was not about being trapped. It was about choosing something that might change everything, something that might not be easy to walk away from later. I glanced toward the door again, just for a second, just enough to confirm that it was still there, still an option, still real. And then I looked back at him, and the distance between those 2 points felt different now, not like a path I needed to take, but like a line I had already stepped away from without noticing. and that realization settled in quietly, without drama, without urgency. Just a calm understanding that whatever decision I made next, it would not be because I had to, it would be because I chose to stay. The quiet that followed felt different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but settled in a way that made everything sharper, clearer, like the moment right before something irreversible happens. And I stood there with that awareness pressing in, realizing that the decision I had been avoiding was no longer something abstract. It was here, immediate, waiting. I let out a slow breath, steadying myself. Because for the first time since this started, I was not reacting to him, not responding to the situation. I was choosing, and that shift changed everything. You knew I would get here, I said, and it was not a question, not really. More like an acknowledgement of something that had been building all along, and he did not deny it, did not soften it, just met my gaze with that same calm certainty that had carried us to this point. I knew you would understand, he replied, and there was a difference in that wording, subtle but important, because it was not about control, not about predicting my actions. It was about believing I would see things the way he did. Eventually, I shook my head slightly, a quiet exhale escaping me. Because that distinction should have mattered more, should have made it easier to accept, but instead it made it heavier, because it meant this was never just about him leading and me following. It was about me arriving here on my own terms, even if the path had been shaped along the way. You are very patient, I said, and there was something almost incredulous in my voice, because I was only just realizing how much of this had depended on waiting rather than forcing, on letting me move at my own pace while still guiding the direction. He did not respond immediately, and when he did, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. I do not rush decisions that matter, he said, and that landed deeper than I expected, because it framed everything differently, not as a manipulation, not as a strategy, but as something he had chosen to invest time in, something he had considered worth waiting for. I looked away for a second, letting that settle, because it changed the weight of everything. Made it harder to dismiss, harder to reduce to something simple and transactional. And I matter, I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could filter them, not as a question, not entirely as a statement, but something in between, something that felt too important to leave unspoken. When I looked back at him, there was no hesitation in his expression, no pause in his response, just that same steady certainty that had been there from the beginning, but now felt different, more open, more direct. Yes, he said, and there was no elaboration, no need for it, because the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything more detailed could have. The air between us felt still again, but not empty, filled instead with the quiet understanding of everything that had just been said, everything that had led up to this point. And I realized that the fear I had been holding on to, the hesitation, the resistance, it had all been tied to the idea that I was being pulled into something without control. But standing here now, that was no longer true. I had the door behind me. I had the option to walk away. I had every reason to choose the life I knew instead of the one in front of me. And yet, I did not move, not because I could not, but because I did not want to. Then I am not staying because I have to, I said slowly, more to myself than to him, testing the truth of it as I spoke, and it settled in place, steady and undeniable. No, he replied, and there was something almost softer in his tone now, something that matched the shift in the room, in me, in everything. I took a small step closer, not thinking about it, not analyzing it, just moving in a way that felt natural, and for the first time since this began, it did not feel like I was stepping into a role. It felt like I was stepping into something real. I am staying because I choose to, I finished, and the words did not feel uncertain, did not feel forced. They felt right in a way that surprised me, in a way that settled something I had not even realized was unsettled. He watched me for a moment, not reacting immediately, like he was letting that decision exist on its own without needing to shape it. And then, finally, he nodded once, a small, controlled movement that somehow carried more meaning than anything else he had done so far, because it was not approval, not confirmation, it was acknowledgement, and that was enough. The shift did not feel dramatic. There was no sudden change in the air or in the way he stood, but something had settled between us that had not been there before, something quieter and more solid, like a line that had finally been crossed without resistance. I could feel it in the way I no longer looked at the door, no longer measured the distance between staying and leaving, because that calculation had already been made. Not in a single moment, but in every small hesitation that led here. He did not step closer right away, and that in itself felt different, like he was giving the space room to exist without trying to shape it, without guiding it forward, and I realized that for the first time, he was not anticipating my next move, he was waiting for it. So what happens now? I asked, and the question felt natural, not uncertain, just a continuation of something that had already begun, and he held my gaze for a second before answering, like he was considering the weight of it in a way he had not needed to before. Now it is real, he said, and there was no hesitation in that, no distance, just a quiet certainty that settled into the space between us like it had always belonged there. I let out a small breath at that, because simple words had never carried this much meaning before, not when they removed the structure we had been relying on, the rules that had made everything feel controlled, predictable, contained. It was already real for you, I pointed out, not as a challenge but as an acknowledgement of everything he had said before, and he nodded once, a small movement that felt more open than anything else he had done. Yes, he said, and there was no attempt to elaborate, no need to justify it, because the truth of it was already clear. I looked at him for a moment longer, studying the way he stood, the way he carried that certainty without forcing it, and I realized that what had unsettled me before was not the idea that he had been sure all along. It was the fact that I had not been, that I had been moving through this without understanding what it was becoming. And if I changed my mind, I asked, not because I expected to, but because I needed to know that the option still existed, that this was not another version of something I could not step away from. His expression shifted slightly, not in a way that closed off, but in a way that acknowledged the weight of the question, like he understood that this was not doubt, but something closer to reassurance. Then you tell me, he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no resistance, just a straightforward answer that did not try to control the outcome. I nodded slowly, letting that settle, because that was what had been missing before, not the ability to leave, but the understanding that staying was not something that would be held against me later, that it would not turn into something I could not step out of if I needed to. The silence that followed was not empty, it was steady, comfortable in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet right, like something that had taken time to reach this point and did not need to be rushed any further. I took a step closer then, not because I felt pulled, not because I was following a pattern, but because it felt like the natural next movement, like something that did not need to be overthought. He did not react immediately, did not close the distance further, just stayed where he was, letting me define it this time. And that shift in itself said more than anything else could have. You are not going to say anything dramatic, I said. A small hint of something lighter in my voice now, something that had not been there before, and he looked at me for a second, something almost amused flickering beneath the calm surface. No, he replied, and there was a simplicity in that felt grounding, like he did not need to fill the space with words to make the moment real. I let out a quiet breath, feeling something settle fully into place for the first time since this began. Not tension, not uncertainty, but something steadier, something that did not need to be defined immediately to be understood, and standing there, in a place that no longer felt borrowed, with a decision that no longer felt forced, I realized that whatever this was, it was no longer something I was trying to figure out. It was something I was already part of, something I had already chosen, even before I said it out loud. It did not feel like an ending, not really, even though every part of this should have led to one, a clean conclusion, a clear line between what was before and what came after, but instead it felt like standing at the beginning of something I had not planned for, something I had not expected, and somehow that made it more real than anything else. The city outside had not changed, the lights still stretching endlessly, the quiet hum of traffic still weaving through the distance. But the way I saw it had shifted, like I was no longer looking at something separate from me, but something I had stepped away from without losing entirely. I moved slightly, not away from him, but not closer either, just enough to feel the space between us settle into something natural, something that did not need to be measured or questioned anymore. This is going to change things, I said, and it was not uncertainty in my voice, just awareness, because no matter how steady this felt, it was still something new, something that would ripple outward in ways I could not fully predict. He watched me for a moment, his expression as composed as ever, but there was something quieter beneath it now, something that matched the shift I felt. And when he answered, his voice carried that same calm certainty, but without the edge it once had. "It already has," he said, and that was true, not in some distant future sense, but in the way I stood here now, in the way I was no longer calculating exits or measuring distance, in the way I had already let go of the idea that this was temporary. I let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, because there was something strangely grounding about that, about acknowledging that the change had already happened, that I was not stepping into it. I was already in it. "You make it sound simple," I said, and there was something lighter in my tone now, not because it was easy, but because I was no longer resisting it the same way. "It is not simple," he replied, and for the first time, there was a hint of something more open in his voice, something that acknowledged the complexity without trying to reduce it. "It is just clear," and that distinction settled in a way that made sense, because clarity did not remove difficulty. It just removed confusion. I nodded slightly, letting that sit, because that was what this had been missing before, not simplicity, but clarity, the understanding of what this actually was instead of what I thought it was supposed to be. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was steady, like something that did not need to be filled immediately, and I realized that I was no longer waiting for him to say something next, no longer expecting him to guide the moment forward, because for the first time, that responsibility did not belong to him alone. I glanced toward the door one last time, not out of habit, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement, because it was still there, still an option, still a line I could cross if I chose to. And then I looked back at him, and the difference between those two directions felt final in a way it had not before, not because one was closed, but because I had already chosen the other. "So this is where we start," I said, and the words felt right, not as a conclusion, but as something that followed naturally from everything that had led here. He held my gaze for a moment, and then he nodded once, that same controlled, deliberate movement, but this time it felt different, less like acknowledgement of a role and more like agreement between two people who had reached the same point from different directions. "Yes," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no distance, just that steady certainty that had been there from the beginning, but now felt shared instead of one-sided. I let that settle, feeling something shift fully into place, something that no longer felt uncertain or incomplete, and for the first time since this began, I was not trying to figure out what came next. I was ready to step into it. And as I stood there, no longer measuring the distance between staying and leaving, no longer questioning the weight of the choice I had made, I realized that whatever this was, it was not something I had been pulled into. It was something I had walked into on my own, something I had chosen even before I understood it. And that meant it was not just his to hold on to anymore. It was ours. Something we would have to figure out together, starting now.